Yeah. Hi, good morning, everyone. Why do we bother building apps? It's kind of early in the morning to be getting philosophical on you, but bear with me. So we build apps, we get paid for it, and that's nice, of course. I'm not knocking that. But ultimately, what we're doing is we're trying to solve a problem, a real problem for an end user. And that gives us some power. We have the power to engage and delight and enable that user. But if we're not careful, we also have the power to exclude and frustrate the user. So today we're going to be talking about building accessible apps on the Salesforce platform. Just bear with me, I've got a comedy clicker as usual. Okay, so talking about accessibility, I'm using an accessible slide deck. It's like accessibility inception. You might not know that PowerPoint has accessibility features in. It's a discovery for me. But yeah, if you look at this slide deck, there's alt text and everything. All of the elements have descriptive names, and they're in a logical order so that tabbing through works as you'd expect. And there's a full transcript on every slide, including descriptions of all of the demos. And I've used a tool that's built into PowerPoint, which is the accessibility checker. So I'll make this available online after, and you can share it or consume it however you choose. My name is David Frudd. I'm a developer at Financial Force. Financial Force is an ISV. We build financials and services automation and other back-end applications. If you want to come and say hi, visit us at kiosk number 2 in the Success Lodge. Okay, so we don't have a lot of time. We've only got 20 minutes, and we're going to cover the why, what, how, who, and when of accessibility. That's not a lot of time, but there will be time for code. There's always time for code. And there will be some demos. I left my glamorous assistant at home, so they're only pre-recorded videos. Apologies. But demos of sorts. Okay, so let's get into it. It's a forward-looking statement. Make your purchasing decisions on stuff that's available today. In this slide deck, there's nothing that isn't available today, so you can just ignore that. Okay, so back in 2011, the World Health Organization prepared a report on worldwide disability where they estimated somewhere around 15%, or 1 in 7 people live with some form of disability. That's a lot. That's a large proportion of your user base, and one you can't afford to ignore. Salesforce aren't ignoring it. They've put lots of work into their platform, into all the documentation, into Trailhead, to make sure that it's accessible. And they've made a lot of effort here today at Dreamforce with Ability Force, with a sign down here. I've just noticed you. That's really helpful. Yeah, so Salesforce do it, and Microsoft do it, Google do it. All the big tech companies are putting a lot of investment into preparing tools, preparing resources, blog posts, guidelines, making sure that other people can deliver accessible applications too. So why did they do that? Let's have a little quiz. Why do they even care? Is it A, they're just covering their own backs? Is it B, they're do-gooders trying to make the world a better place? Or is it C, the cynical amongst you might think it's all just self-interest, all about the profits, all about the bottom line? Well, in general, it's some combination of all of the above. If you want to take accessibility home and put it to your manager and get some investment, you might want to focus on the profit-based reasons. So, reasons to care. There's lots of good legal reasons to care about it. The web moves very quickly. The law does not. The law is still catching up with the web. There is some general anti-discrimination laws that can be applied to web technologies, such as the Section 508 amendment to the Rehabilitation Act, which essentially means that if you want to sell your software to federal agencies, you need to be developing accessible applications so that their employees can use it. In fact, you need to be developing accessible applications to stay on the right side of any company that wants to hire a diverse workforce. There is also specific anti-discrimination law that applies to the web, such as the CVAA. And you can see that's more recent in terms of the law, 2010. That's really recent. And that enshrines audio and video accessibility into communications devices, things like instant messengers, phones, emails, any kind of communication device, and also anything that's capable of playing a TV program. So just to make sure that you are using or providing the ability to provide subtitles, closed captions, audio descriptions, if they're available. There's good social reasons to care as well. Web accessibility is good for everyone. When we're building applications, we want to make sure that everyone can use them, young or old, disabled or not. We want to make sure that they can use them, our applications, in more places. We want them to use them in the office or in the garden or on the train or in a really quiet library. And when they use them, we want them to get the most out of the application. So it's helping everyone. And specifically for disabled users, it can mean the difference between being able to use your application at all or not. So the number of people that we're helping is increasing because the number of disabled users is also on the rise. There's lots of different reasons for that. People are living longer, surviving different medical conditions, retiring later on. And there's also just more and more computers in more and more workplaces. So this helps everyone. And finally, let's come down to brass tacks, profit. When you're talking about audience reach, the more people that you can sell your product to, the more sales you'll make. It's quite simple. In terms of productivity, if you are enabling your users, then they're going to get the most out of the application and use all of your premium features. When it comes time to contract renew, then they're more likely to renew that contract. And they're more likely to talk about it positively and recommend it to their friends and to other businesses. It's a good way of demonstrating corporate social responsibility, and it can demonstrate a commitment to acting ethically as an organization. You can demonstrate progressive thinking. You can show that your organization is a thought leader and is tackling accessibility proactively. And finally, reduce legal risk, because nobody wants the cost to their time, their reputation, and money of being on the wrong side of an anti-discrimination lawsuit. Okay, so web accessibility. I've taken this definition from Wikipedia, but the key phrase there is all about removing barriers. We all like removing barriers. So let's learn about the barriers. You have to know your enemy. You'll see this in any talk about accessibility. Just make sure that we're all on the same page and understand what we're dealing with so that we're better able to solve the problem. When we're talking about visual barriers, we're talking about people who have no or limited vision at all or some of their field of vision, or are unable to see certain colors. When we're talking about audio issues, we're talking about no or limited hearing, and we're talking about inability to hear at all or some frequencies. Also conditions such as tinnitus. With physical barriers, we're talking about users who have difficulties using traditional input devices. Cognitive, people who have difficulty remembering lots of information or where they are in a process, or find that numbers and letters get scrambled when they're trying to read text on screen. And neurological barriers, where certain animations or effects can cause nausea, headaches, or even seizures. So we're going to see some examples of the good and the bad, which will help us to understand what not to do. So here's an example. It's a mock-up of a Lightning component, which you can use to select an appointment from a table. It looks okay. It's pretty intuitive to use. The appointments have 3 states. They're either available, limited, or unavailable. But it's not so easy to use if you are colorblind. So let's stick with the Lightning design system. We've changed all of the actions into actual button tags, which means they'll be understood by a screen reader. And we've used the disabled state to demarcate any unavailable appointments, which has another advantage, which is that when you're tabbing through, it'll just skip over those unavailable buttons. And you have really good contrast ratio on this screen. Okay, so be consistent, follow conventions, don't subvert what your user expects and what they've got used to, and don't rely on color alone. When you're using a screen reader, it sort of favors keyboard-only navigation. Make sure that you're using appropriate tags. So use a button appropriately, use anchors, use divs. Don't try to make something look like something else because the screen reader might not understand it. Use headings appropriately and in a logical order. Make sure you're providing alternative text. And think about the focus. There's no substitute for actually tabbing through your application and making sure there's no traps, no focus black holes where you can't escape once you're on a set of components constantly passing the focus back and forth. You don't want to be there. And make sure that you group related elements like radio button groups or checklist groups or tabs. Okay, videos. Let's go back to last year's keynote, some inspirational words. Let's have a listen.
And he's transforming this whole company around us.
Inspirational words as long as you can hear them. I hope you've all been practicing lip reading. If you turn on closed captions, it becomes a lot easier to consume this, even if you have audio issues. Okay, so now everyone knows who made Mark Benioff's suit. It's really important. So consider whether or not you really need videos, use them sparingly, and make sure that you provide alternatives wherever possible. If you do have to include a video, make sure you include subtitles and audio descriptions to cater for both video and audio barriers. This is a Kanban component, but you wouldn't know it by looking at it. We're making the user work in this little letterbox, and there's no indication that these tiles can be dragged around on the page. So be kind to your users. Give them large clickable areas, give them enough time to do the work that you're giving them to do, and give them the chance to correct any errors along the way. And make sure that you're supporting non-traditional input devices. So here's the same component, but now it's a lot easier to use. We've given the user context so that they know a bit about each of these locations at Dreamforce, and they know that they can drag these around because we're using the standard icon that shows that it's a draggable tile. We're using colored icons to show what's available in each location. And finally, if the user can't use drag and drop, we've got a drop-down where you can manually change the status for each tile. So this is a lot easier to use. You might find this text quite difficult to read. You might find the lower text a lot easier to read. So I'm not saying that the first bit of text is impossible to read, but I'm saying it's not enjoyable. It's a chore, and you don't want to give your users extra chores. So keep your code clean, keep your applications clean, use appropriate voice and tone, and there's some really good guidelines provided by Salesforce on your voice and tone. If you follow them, then your application will be more cohesive within the larger organization picture. Use an appropriate font, a true type font with no serifs. Be consistent, make sure you're referring to things using the same terminology throughout. Provide context for anything that's on screen, and use white space liberally. If your application looks like this, there's a problem. Just save the laser light show from Metallica tonight. Don't use strobe flickering or flashing effects. There's a seizure risk, nausea risk. It's also distracting. It's just so 1990s. Don't do it. OK, so now we've seen what not to do. Let's build an actual component. This is a Lightning component, and let's step through each of the parts of this page. This is a form for doing a search, but it's not so easy to use if you can't see the labels. So this is a screen reader that doesn't have associated labels with the form fields. Don't do that to your users. Let's have a look at the code that's driving this component. We have a Lightning card that's creating the entire body for the component, and we're using an icon, a standard icon for search, which will be used throughout the application for that consistency that we were after from earlier. Each of the actions is in a button group. We're using buttons, we're providing alternative text if it's an icon-only button, and we're providing labels for each of them. The primary action is demarked as such because it's got the brand variant. So that means that this is the action we want you to use. And each of the form fields is using the appropriate HTML5 type. So we've got date fields for dates. We've got a search field for a search. They inherit all the styling and the sizing because of the HTML5 input type. So work with your browser, not against it. Each of them obviously has a label, and that's associated with it. And the field that's required is marked with the required field. So it's not just got a red box around it. There's an actual asterisk that you can see in a screen reader. OK, so let's try using this. Let's try using it with a keyboard alone. So this is the demo I promised. Just a quick word. I'm using a few different tools here. In the bottom, you can see my key presses. That's a tool called Keycaster. It's just going to show you what I'm typing. I'm also using VoiceOver, which is built into the Mac. It's a screen reader. So let's hit go. So there's my key presses. You might see that weird option icon. And backspace. So let's turn on VoiceOver.
VoiceOver on Chrome. As the example, vertical line Salesforce. Google Chrome. David. FF. Window. Address and search bar. Edit text has keyboard. Link.
OK, so VoiceOver is helping us out because it's reading all of the available information out loud. But there's also a little bar down here where it's got the actual text. It's got its own closed captions. So let's let VoiceOver continue and speak to us with a reassuring British accent.
Skip to navigation. You are currently on a link inside of web content. To take this link, press caps lock space to exit.
Did you see what happened there? I tabbed off of the address bar and into the page, and a secret link came up. This is like an Easter egg for accessible enthusiasts. Skip to navigation, and its friend, skip to content. If you imagine trying to navigate through any Lightning page using keyboard alone, and you have to jump through the search bar, the favorites bar, the global actions, the help, the setup, all of these different things, and then every single tab until you get to the content, that's going to get very old very fast. These shortcuts allow you to jump to the content you're interested in, and that's provided out of the box by Salesforce. So let's hit skip to content and get to the actual component.
Then press caps lock, shift up arrow. Link. Skip to main content. You are currently on a link inside of web content. To take this link, press caps lock space to exit this web area. Search. Settings clear. Search. Date from. Date from select date.
OK, so that's telling me about the component.
Search term. Search term group. Settings button. Settings. You are currently on button.
VoiceOver there recognized that we were focusing on a button element, and it knew that it was for settings, so that's great. Skip over the clear button, get over to the search button, and let's just hit search. But we have a problem. We haven't completed all of the required fields. So we get a toast notification, and VoiceOver tells me what the problem was. And the focus is on the close button on the toast notification. That toast notification will go away on its own. And when it does, we want to put focus somewhere useful for the user, which is on the required field, so they can correct the error immediately.
Post alert, post button. Post. D. E. Stay to select today. Please select today, the 17th search button. Success. Search.
Success. So we completed the form, we used it, we used keyboard alone and VoiceOver. So that was great. Let's see how we achieved that. Let's look at the actual JavaScript code that's driving this form. We're going to essentially go through each of the form fields and tell them to update and tell us whether or not they're valid. And then we're going to find if there's a problem field. There might not be. But if there is, then we're going to focus on it and show the toast notification telling the user that something went wrong. If we didn't find an invalid field, then we're just going to tell the user everything was fine. This doesn't come out of the box with Salesforce. You have to do a little work yourself. But it's not too much work. Similarly, if you're using Visualforce, it's very similar. Make sure that you're putting labels on things. Make sure you're using buttons. So yeah, let's recap. Here are the takeaways. This is slide that you might want to take a picture of. I'm not going to read through the table, but these are the things that we need to take into account. So consider this a call to action. If you want to bring accessibility home in your organization, then you need to get engagement, put forward the business case. Education plays a very key role. Make sure that you are encouraging empathy, make sure that your users know the nature of the problems that they're trying to solve, and put in guidelines to help your developers and your testers spot problems with accessibility. There's no substitute for trying it out. You can either just ditch your keyboard and mouse, or there are extensions for browsers that allow you to emulate different disabilities, and you can use a screen reader. Okay, running really short on time here. So when you're delivering, build it into your acceptance criteria. Make sure that features aren't considered done until you have tested them for accessibility. Find the key areas that are used most and make sure that you are tackling them first. Monitor for accessibility using tools so that you can spot any regressions, and wherever possible, make sure that real users with disabilities are using the product. Get feedback early and often, and if you don't have anyone to hand, then consider bringing in an external auditor team who are experts in this area and can advise you on how to build the best applications. Okay, so we're building Salesforce for all. It's important to remember that accessibility is not just a feature that you can deliver and forget. It's not just for Christmas, it's for life. It requires constant vigilance. But the payoff is an application that can be used by more people in more places more effectively. And who doesn't want that? So that takes us to the end. I'm going to hang out over there if you have any questions, or you can always hit me up on Twitter. Thank you very much, and here's some resources you might find useful. Thank you.